Hello, hi. So today we're going to look at basically how we prepare for the IB new syllabus, IB Bio HL paper, new syllabus, which is basically 2025. Since this May is going to be essentially the first paper that we are going to sit for, we're going to look at certain strategies of how we prepare for the paper. So essentially, this year there's a bit of a structure difference. You have papers that are only divided for HL into two papers. We have paper one and paper two. Paper 2 is very similar to the old syllabus, so there is not much of a significant change in paper 2. But paper 1 has changed quite significantly because in the earlier syllabus there was also paper 3, which has been completely removed. But some parts of paper 3 have been incorporated into paper 1 and some parts into paper 2. We are first going to look at essential tips on how we handle paper 1. Paper 1 actually is now divided into two papers. We have paper 1A and we have paper 1B. Paper 1A is very similar to what we have already seen before in terms of IB paper 1s, which is you have 40 MCQ questions, multiple choice questions. Of course, there are certain strategies that we look at a little later when we look at the individual papers and how we can approach them. We have 40 MCQs and it's for 60 minutes. That means essentially you have 1.5 minutes per question. But I tell my students that you need to do it at 1.25 minutes per question max. And there are certain strategies. For example, some parts of the paper one, we can essentially do it faster. Why? Because the first few questions are very similar and they go on a fixed pattern. For example, the first few questions are related to different subtopics. For example, the first question here is related to water, which falls under A 1.1. These questions in the first 10 questions are usually pretty fast and you do not require 1.25 minutes for these questions. So therefore you can speed up answering these questions. However, it'll have a mixture of SL and HL, but it follows a fixed pattern. You will see questions related to water. Then as we move forward, this is related to DNA. Then this is carbohydrates, lipid unit. So different subunits are present here. And of course, revision will help to answer these questions. In MCQs, two predominant methods of answering is one is basically the first attempt that you do is basically based on your revision and it's attempted on your gut. So this allows you to answer gut meaning immediate instinct answer. So you will answer faster. However, the second attempt, especially for questions that are a bit difficult, ideally you will mark in the question paper itself, you will do the elimination strategy in order to ensure that you cut off the wrong answers to finally verify for yourself that this is how you would, this is the most correct answer, essentially. And however, I tell my students in generally over the past years, and because it's a new syllabus, traditionally questions involving genetics, they like, Punnett squares and inheritance. For example, in this current past paper, let's say question number 31, this is involving genetics. They traditionally have some type of tricky part towards it. In this video, I will not be showing how I would answer each individual question, but I'll give you an overall understanding of how you will approach the overall paper. So as I told you, each question you will spend essentially about 1.25 minutes. That means that you can essentially finish the paper in approximately around 50 minutes, which gives you an extra 10 minutes to proofread. Some students or most students in this extra 10 minutes, they will use the second technique that I just told you, which is elimination, to eliminate the wrong answers essentially. But as I told you, it's a pattern. So usually the first 1 to 15 questions is quite straightforward. And then it basically gets more difficult as we go towards the harder HL units. In terms of the overall syllabus, the syllabus has actually decreased because the paper 3 contents have been removed, which used to be options. But overall, it's only reduced by about approximately 5%. So majority of the content of the old syllabus is applicable for the new syllabus. So I suggest my students to use old syllabus question banks to practice for the new syllabus questions. Paper 1A, and then there is no gap between paper 1B. Paper 1B is for 1 hour as well, but this one is a new introduction entirely. It is going to be testing on experimental plus data-based questions. Now, even in the earlier syllabus, database questions were there. They were tested predominantly in section A of paper 2. But now they have introduced this. Actually, it is directly taken away from the section A of paper 3 earlier. So I tell my students, if you want to practice, because there won't be much practice for these kind of questions, because there's a new syllabus, we only have the specimen paper as something as a guide that we can try to see the patterns in the paper. So for these experimental plus database questions, HKExcel has prepared a whole booklet of questions of the past years that we can accumulate and we can try these questions. These are called experimental questions. And now I'm going to show you basically there is a small problem with this paper because these experimental questions and database questions, they are related to your syllabus statements. So that means in each topic, there is a certain experiment that you have to do. But unfortunately, IB has no fixed list of experiments. It is actually under the discretion of the school. Depending on the equipment your school has, the school will essentially has been advised to do those experiments. So now, basically, if that is the case, it makes a lot of students anxious as to whether they will have covered all the experiments or they have missed some experiments. So there's no fixed list for these experimental questions that you can practice from or understand. However, it's basically under the capacity of each individual school. However, that means if, for example, if the school has not covered the syllabus fast enough and they are behind in the syllabus, in that case, then they might not cover all the experimental questions that they can ask you or all the different experiments. So we have prepared essentially a document which shows all the practical work that is present in the IB syllabus. So how do we do that? So we're going to see a document essentially talking about how we can practice for this by looking at the different experimental procedures that are there in our syllabus or the school should have covered over time. So I'm just going to show you what are those practicals and how we will approach each of those practicals to prepare. If you ask me, the hardest part of the new syllabus in order to prepare for, it would be paper 1B, because paper 1B has a lot of questions that are going to be new because that paper did not exist before. And we're going to essentially look at some of those practicals, and I've made a small summary for you guys to go through in terms of what are the different practicals they can ask you from. So these are the different experiments that we have in our syllabus. For example, in the first topic, we have in terms of water, we have an experiment to investigate osmosis that falls under theme A in the IB syllabus, which has new syllabus that has been divided into 4 themes. So we look at what are we trying to investigate here to understand how osmosis affects plant cells, its importance in maintaining cellular balance. We also, because it's experimental and the type of questions they can give you is quite challenging, we look at the different materials there is, we investigate those, we look at the procedure, we evaluate the procedure. We also essentially look at how we can write analysis that is including the conclusion as well as the discussion in terms of osmosis. So that is the first experiment. Like that, we have multiple experiments, like DNA extraction is another one, microscopy is another one. All these fall under theme A. So we need to investigate these experiments because that's the best way to prepare for this paper. For each of these experiments listed in this document, there's just 2 parts. I know many students, many of you are familiar with IAs. We look at each of these experiments in 2 sections. That is the controlled variables of this experiment, because IB questions are traditionally to do with controlled variables for that experiment. So we look at control variables as well as the procedure, which will allow you to evaluate these investigations. And IB questions are always related to evaluating these questions. So we're going to see, for example, I told you the first experiment was investigating osmosis. In the specimen paper that IB has released, actually the first question is related to osmosis as well. This is the specimen paper 1B, like I just told you. It's a 2-hour paper. they've claimed it because 1A is what I just discussed with you, MCQ paper, and 1B is basically the experimental / data response questions. So experimental this is the first one. They're doing an experiment on beetroot. Similarly, they're looking or observing osmosis. As you can observe, this is the first practical I was discussing here in this list. So the questions in this paper, the paper 1B, should essentially come from the themes that are listed in this document. So we need to prepare for each of them, and each of them have given essentially like a skeleton of what the experiment should look like. However, as I told you, we will be looking, when students are preparing for this paper, they need to look at controlled variables plus evaluation points for each of them. So then you can make short notes on that so that you can tackle any type of question that they ask you in such a paper, where they will ask you experimental. So this is the same experiment that we just discussed about osmosis. We find the percentage change in mass versus, in this case, sucrose concentration. It'll be very similar. It won't be the exact experiment that is listed here. However, it'll be very similar. So here it's plant cells. In the IB paper, they have directly spoken about beetroot, which is also plant cells. So we can find the percentage change in mass. So essentially you see here IV, independent variable, other parts of the experiment itself in terms of control variables. So the questions actually themed in terms of control variables, procedure, and evaluation. So I want you to practice it in that sense. Of course, this paper also has some database questions, and I'm going to teach you how we will approach database. The approach will be very similar for paper 2 as well as paper 1B because there's a kind of overlap. So that's how essentially we'll be practicing or preparing for IB paper 1 and paper 2. Paper 1 is entirely content based. So very little practical based questions there, but mostly skills and understandings. So it will be theory based, but experimental database questions we can say is a bit of theory because you study about osmosis, but it's also a bit of experimental questions which you develop skills over the 2 years. That will be the 2 papers for paper 1. IB does not allow you to leave the examination center between the 2 papers, so it will be continuous. You'll be sitting for the paper continuously. Next, I'm going to essentially look at paper 2, which is actually the bigger paper, because in terms of percentages, IB paper 1 approximately fits about 36% of your grade. Paper 2, and it's 2 hours in total, whereas paper 2 is 2.5 hours, and it approximates or it gives us a grade equivalent of 44%. So both these papers together accumulate 80%, and 20%, of course, as we know, is the IA, that is the internal investigation, which is long submitted. Now we're going to look at paper 2. In terms of paper 2, there are basically 2 parts. It's the bigger paper. Many students find the paper 2 more daunting traditionally. But now in this syllabus, I feel it's a bit more balanced. Paper 1 and paper 2 are equally daunting. So paper 2 has 2 parts. We have section A and we have essentially section B. Section A, I tell my students to dedicate 60 minutes. 60 minutes essentially is for 2 parts because section A has data-based questions, very similar to paper 1B questions, but slightly this will be harder because it is out of scope. That means it is similar to what you're studying in IB, but out of your syllabus type of experiments or data. Then I'll teach you some techniques of how you can practice for this. And then it also has short response questions. So we're going to see how paper 2 looks like now. And so you said the first part is section A, which starts with this is data-based and experimental type of questions, but predominantly data-based questions. And you also have in the same section, these are called short response questions, which have 2 or 1 markers. They're not too long, but you need to answer this part quite fast. And it'll be directly related to the theory that you have studied. So in paper 1A, we have database questions. We also have short response questions. Together, both of them, you can spend 60 minutes, that is 1 hour's time. It's majority of time taken for database because database is a bit tricky and you need to prepare for database, and it sometimes can be really daunting, especially if the graphs look really confusing and stuff. So database questions at MS students would traditionally give it about 35 minutes out of the 1 hour. And what is the guidance for database questions? It's about practice. HKExcel has prepared a booklet of all the database questions that you have in the syllabus. You can practice 1 per week, or at least 2 to 3 per week before the exam as you lead on to the exam. But here I have prepared another document of command terms, which allow you to answer these questions more effectively. If you look at the database questions, which is the harder part, you'll see command terms such as calculate, outline. These are called question command terms. And these command terms have a fixed pattern of how we answer them. So you have calculate, you have outline, you also have outline again here, suggest. I have prepared a booklet of how you will approach each of these questions, and that is this booklet. So you have essentially all the different command terms that IB questions can test you, and these are actually past IB question examples and how you would answer if they asked you to annotate a question. So similarly, you will find all the different command statements listed in this booklet with examples of IB questions. I hope that's clear. So you essentially, when you practice database questions, you can keep this booklet as a guide for you. So like we just spoke about, this is an example of a suggest database question and how we would approach it. This is the actual question from an IB paper and how we can use this graph to answer the question. So this is like the marking scheme and special tips for that type of command statement, applying reasoning, pay attention to number of marks, practice these questions. Also, there are other suggest questions are usually, they have a larger marking scheme because they have a bigger scope for answers. So each of these command statements, I want you to keep this booklet next to you so it allows you to practice and eventually it becomes habitual for you when you attain those questions. For example, something like describe is a really broad command statement which can come in a database question like this where they ask you to analyze the graph, or it can come in paper 2 long answers to describe a long answer. So for each of these, how you would approach, there's guidance in this. And so that will be essentially paper 1, section A of paper 2, 35 minutes, quite difficult in terms of some students, so practice matters. Short response is pure theory. So if you practice theory really well, the short and memorize your content really well, this short response will be easily manageable. And then we come to the main part of paper 2, which is section B. For HL paper, they give you 3 questions and you need to answer 2 out of them. Each question will have part A, B, and C. Traditionally, these sections will accumulate to the majority of paper 2. So we're going to look at how this part looks like in the real exam paper. This is all section B. As you can observe, they give you 3 questions here. You need to answer 2 of them. Of course, that depends on actual individual skills of which you find easy to answer. And they also give you 1 additional mark for the construction of an answer for each question. So you can construct your long answers really well, and therefore you get additional marks for it. And this accumulates, if you see total 8 plus 7, 15 marks, so you can get additional mark as well. And you need to answer 2 out of 3. And each of these questions, I tell my students to essentially give 45 minutes each. 45 minutes for each of this. That's why this part is longer for each of these questions. So let's say question number 8 and 9 you will be doing. So you'll spend 45 minutes each. That is 30 minutes doing the question itself and 15 minutes that will be checking up whether you have answered all of them. Inside these 15 minutes or the 30 minutes, you also have some section called planning, which you can elaborate further on how you would plan your answer and then you would answer it. So, but paper 2 is usually daunting. So it's good to keep check of your time. So it essentially allows you to plan your paper more smoothly to answer the overall IB exam. That's the very short summary of how you would prepare for each of these papers, paper 1A, 1B, and paper 2. And we just ran through how we would prepare for each of them. Any minor details, of course, there are more further examination tips you can get from HKExcel in terms of how you would approach each paper, how you would prepare for each individual question style. So 2 important documents. One is the command statement booklet, which is talking about all the command statements and how you would answer those. The second one is essentially the practical questions they can ask you. So each of these experiments, you will go in detail and you will use that detail to answer question or paper 1B, which is the more unique one for the new syllabus. That's it. Thank you.